for coming for this early morning talk. And before we go on, I want to welcome the Dean and say a few words and then we'll continue this. Dean Washington.
Okay. So we are very pleased to have Mike Dorsey as our seminar speaker today. Mike got his bachelor degree from the University of Michigan, and then a master degree from Yale, another master degree from Michigan University. Johns Hopkins, yeah. Then he got his PhD from University of Michigan. After that, he worked as a faculty member in Dartmouth, and a long list of other non-academic jobs. Currently, he works in the United Nations in charge of three very interesting programs. One is about sustainable energy. The second is about climate justice and policy. The third is small island nations. So these are all what we really care about. So let's welcome Mike.
Thank you all for having me, and thanks for coming out this morning. It's my understanding that you were in the midst of your finals, so you clearly are committed either to this seminar or these issues or a mixture of both. And thanks to Kamzima for making sure I got here safely, as well as Heidi Hutner in sustainability studies. So today, what I want to spend about the next 45 minutes about is talking about sort of the state of play in climate policy, particularly at the multilateral level, and really to step out of that quickly to think about responses to what I'll be referring to as hegemonic climate policy. It's always tricky to give a talk to a cast of folks that aren't coming from your sort of social science disciplinary orientations. So feel free to chime in and interrupt with any questions, and I'll try my hardest to steer clear of acronyms and whatnot. Basically, what I want to do in order to sort of set the tone and talk about hegemonic climate policy or hegemonic climate governance is sort of do really three broad things. First of all, sort of talk about why to talk about that in the first place. Why should we have a conversation about hegemonic climate governance or climate policy? I view those two things as sort of one and the same.
How's that? Is that better? I hear the acoustics are bad in this room, so I can hear myself, but maybe you can hear me better now. Okay, very good. Okay, good. So one of the reasons that I think it's important to talk about this issue is that really the climate problem at the global level and even at the local level, it's an uneven problem. So I think one of the reasons why we need to understand and have a discussion, and really the reason why there's a discussion in the literature about hegemonic climate governance, it has really a lot to do with the fact that there is this problem of climate injustice, the uneven nature of the climate crisis. So I'm going to open with that fairly briefly to sort of set the context. And then I want to sort of dip into some aspects, and certainly not all of them because we don't have enough time, some aspects of and key features of hegemonic climate governance. We might also call hegemonic climate governance neoliberal governance. So those of you might have come to my talk that I did earlier this term here. I focus a lot on the market side of this issue. This morning I'll focus much more on the governance side of this issue, sort of the aspects of the state and state-driven policy making. You really can't in that first talk, I sort of tricked you, if you were there, and made you believe that you could sort of focus narrowly and exclusively on the market. But you really can't sort of separate the two because they commingle. And I'll look at that. But this morning I'll spend much more time looking at the governance issues and the role of the state in hegemonic climate policy making. And by conclusion, I want to do something that I didn't do last time. It's been the bulk of, or not the bulk of, the latter third of the talk, looking at responses to this middle business, responses or counter-hegemonic responses to climate policy making, particularly as it gets articulated in what we find in literature and what some social movement actors dub climate justice, organizing, policy making, so forth and so on. So it's those three things that I want to talk about. I'll say that one of the things that animates a lot of the work that you'll see and the work that I've been doing, how many of you got a chance to just skim the forthcoming paper that me and Sarah Bracking from Manchester have in Antipope? I think it comes in a couple hands, good. So if you didn't skim it, you can skim it after, and if you don't want to skim it, you can bin it, or you can look at the abstract. But one of the things that motivated that paper in Antipope, that's right now it's under revised and resubmit. They've asked us for a few little clarifications and things, but we'll get that back to them probably in the next couple of weeks. But one of the driving forces behind that paper and a lot of my work is really this question of fairness. Is in this case for hegemonic climate policy making, is it fair? Right? Is the solution the Kyoto Protocol, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change? Are they fair? Do they produce fair solutions? Right? Do they do that? Do they deliver on that? I argue largely no. But that question sort of drives a lot of the research that I've been doing independently and with colleagues. And it's sort of that I want to use as sort of a point of departure to sort of step into the context of, well, what is this climate injustice, or what does that look like out in the world? Well, certainly it's unfolding across scales. It's a phenomenon that's a local to global phenomenon. It takes place, at least in the U.S., in terms of the uneven nature of the unfolding climate crisis. And there's a lot of research that myself and colleagues have done that basically underscores the point that the climate crisis is uneven in as much as whom it affects, right? And also who's responsible for it, right? It's not a situation where everybody's contributing to the problem at the same way, and nor are those that are being affected by experiencing it in the same way. And this is a piece that Richard Miller-Frosch and Manuel Pastor did a couple of years back that really sort of, I think, encapsulates this, that basically, climate it has disproportionate impacts on communities. And in the U.S., that means largely that those that are poor and worse off tend to be harmed first and most. We've got good data that say African Americans contribute somewhere between a quarter or a fifth as much CO2 into the atmosphere as the average white American does. And we also got good data that says that the sort of policy solutions, particularly raising energy prices, tend to be regressive on those very populations that contribute least to the problem. And that's sort of the case broadly in the U.S. You look at communities like this lovely tiny little community down the road, Manhattan, and just a glimpse of what a 2-meter sea level rise would mean for transport infrastructure in Manhattan. And a lot of this oddly echoed in Sandy, basically below Midtown, experiencing extreme flooding. So the point here is that climate crisis and climate problems play out unevenly. Another way of looking at this is that we see that Again, there's disproportionate impacts on marginalized populations in the U.S. in terms of access, or not access, in terms of effects from rising temperatures. We've got some good data that we've been working on. I'm a visiting fellow at the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies in D.C., and we've been working with the Texas Health Institute on a newly funded Clarke Foundation resilience study. We've been looking at a dozen cities across the U.S. and building, really, this is Rachel Frosch's work, building with Rachel and working with Manuel Pastor, and looking at the way in which climate resilience policies are unevenly designed, and the way in which resources don't move evenly to communities that are trying to get access to them. And we see this not only in terms of the policy rollout domestically, but we see this in terms of some of the downside effects of a warming world, as it were. But not only domestically, globally, again, climate activity, the unfolding climate crisis doesn't play out evenly across the globe. And this is some World Bank and WHO data. And basically what we see is several things happening on this graph. We see both the problem of the uneven effect of climate-related disasters increasing through time and affecting more people as we go through time. And up here in the tippy top here is the developing, or the developed world, or the rich world. And we see that those that are harmed first and most are overwhelmingly concentrated in the developing or the global south. Another way of looking at that same graph is to look at it across the globe, and we see again that the effects, the deleterious effects of the unfolding climate crisis that play out unevenly around the globe. Places in the high Andes, sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, affected more extreme than other places in the world. And just so happens that mirroring the kind of the domestic dynamic that we see in the U.S., where certain populations contribute less to the problem, we find that the contributions of the average resident of sub-Saharan Africa relatively minuscule in terms of their overall average contribution of CO2 to the atmosphere, yet the impacts from the unfolding climate crisis highly concentrated on those that are least responsible for the problem. And another sort of last slide here on that issue, a slightly controversial one. One of the first offerings that came from former Secretary General Kofi Annan at the UN when he left the UN was looking at climate-related deaths. Numbers are relatively conservative, but you see a mirroring, if you remember the previous slide, you see a mirroring in where the deaths are concentrated, again, sub-Saharan Africa, to some extent, lesser extent, high Andes, South Asia, and the high Himalaya, etc. So those, again, least responsible, bearing the brunt of the calamity of the unfolding crisis. So why does it all matter? Why does that all matter? Well, it matters because, to recall that first research question, or the thing that's sort of driving, my work is this core solution? Is the solution that we see coming from the United Nations, from conventional climate change, the Kyoto Protocol, the commitment to a host of market practices, is that core solution going to be capable of addressing the uneven nature of the crisis? And so, what does that core solution look like? Well, through time, here's just a sort of a brief glimpse of it, a normative glimpse, as it were. You have the negotiation process beginning before the first United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, and then running essentially into the future. The next round of negotiations coming into this year in Lima, Peru, then going on to what will hopefully become probably called Paris Protocol, but the next binding agreement that countries will lock into will be set down in Paris next year. So that's the normative sort sketch of this. But what's the core solution? I've been hinting at it. I sort of implied and said it, that negotiations process is basically designed to deliver essentially this, a market approach to tackling the unfolding climate crisis, right? Design carbon markets, turn them on, do it in a way that presumably makes it more efficient for those polluters to reduce their emissions through time. And that approach to utilizing the market as laid down in the negotiations is codified in a couple of articles of the Kyoto Protocol and also within the sort of the United Nations Convention on Climate Change itself. You probably remember this slide from last time. What's been the upside of that? The result of that is basically a marketplace that has essentially been in near free fall since its initiation. Marketplace that hasn't really been delivered a sufficiently high or robust carbon price. A marketplace that's been plagued by a lot of problems that I talked about last time. But again, back to the core question here. Is this process fair? Is it fair? And just a couple of sides sort of put your mind into this thinking space, and just a couple that I showed you before. We looked at a couple years back the initiation of the California carbon market process. And what we see here, and what we saw, is that essentially you've got these four committees: an Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, a Market Advisory Group, an Energy and Technology Group, and a Climate Action Team, the sort of science team. And we see the rub here is that little to no institutional relationships between the key components advising the governor. These four sort of task forces were created to advise the governor on how to turn on the carbon marketplace in California. We see no connections institutionally between the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee and the other three key committees. So that sort of problem is mirrored not only in other regional markets, which we can talk about, but it's also mirrored at in the world's largest carbon marketplace, the European Union Emissions Trading System, formerly called the scheme, European Union Emissions Trading Scheme. And in this, what we see here, fairly simply, is we see a universe of buyers and sellers, as well as consultants and those that approve the projects from the clean development mechanism. And we see a small universe of actors in this snapshot, just 24 actors here that control 90% of the credit flow in any given quarter in the European Union Emissions Trading System. So basically, the rub here is that the European Union trading system looks not quite like even a smoothly operating marketplace. Looks more like a kind of on some level, in this slice, looks like an oligarchy, but really is more like almost a duopoly or a monopoly for some reason we can talk about in Q&A. I don't want to spend time on the market side. I said I was going to focus your attention more on the government side, which I'm going to come back to.
Before you go on, sorry.
Yeah.
Could you,
Sure.
how does China go into the European market?
So this is a look at the clean development mechanism universe. And so basically what's happening here is that we see a variety of CDM projects, and actually the numbers is actually in free fall for reasons we can talk about. But China is here because of the CDM projects, clean development mechanism projects that are in China. So credits are being generated from those CDM projects in China, and then they flow into the European system that way. Does that answer that? Okay. Yeah, and please just chime in. I think there aren't that many, and we've got sufficient amount of time to have a back and forth. So I don't want to spend time on this because I spent time on it before. But what we see here, the rub of this is that we have markets at both the sort of domestic level in terms of California and also the world's largest formal marketplace. They're not operating, certainly not in a
efficient way, in a fair way. They believe it with a lot of problems. And many colleagues have sort of written about. And they're not really delivering the solution of avoiding dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system in a way that gets out ahead of the injustice aspects of the problem in the first place. So I said I wanted to focus you more on the structures of government. And again, this is just a normative timeline here of these negotiations. But what's been the output of this normative process? Institutional. Well, it's a complicated picture. One of the first sort of challenges of a slide is, you never want to show text and things on a slide that people can't read at the back of the room. So we just break this slide into three pieces here. The governance structure has essentially meted out three domains of institutional, multilateral management spheres. At the sort of the high end, you've got international agencies, UN agencies, working with the World Bank here, the Global Environmental Facility, and within the World Bank, you have a variety of climate investment funds, and then there are linkages between the World Bank and the regional development banks, to essentially to sort of deliver on the mandates of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. You also have a new and kind of emerging set. Some of them have now been extinguished, like this Yasuni ITT project, which is a national project of Ecuador. You've got a host of national level initiatives, whether from Brazil, Bangladesh, Indonesia. Yasuni is Ecuador, like I said, the Ghana initiative around forest. And the international and the national aspects of climate governance, as it were, those are put together with a long list, and this is an abbreviated list, but a list of bilateral activities that mainly are wealthy countries in the global north, creating funds that ostensibly would be made available for countries in the global south. So that's a sort of a gestalt way of looking at how are governance structures being created to deliver on avoiding dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. In many ways, these aren't the only structures. We could talk about other structures. We could have on here, for example, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We could have on here the UN, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Secretariat, and so forth and so on. I put these up here and divide them into these three categories in part because these are the institutional centers of sort of raising dollars and finance to deliver on, again, avoiding dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. So these are here because in a sort of a crude world, they're designed to actually get the money and go out and deliver programs on the ground with the money that they leverage. Well, what happens when you put together a market-based approach embodied in this sort of graphic with that previous slide of the, I'll call it the multilateral climate finance infrastructure? Well, it looks like this busy thing, which apologies that one side's a bit light, but basically what we have here is we have government monies in this sort of lighter shade here of tan, and the boxes are sized based on price, based on dollar amount, okay? And that government money is basically moving. There's no time on here, but the government money is related with, or public funds are related to private funds. And these sort of two streams of public money on the top, private money on the bottom, it's envisioned by the architects within the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that they get piped through a variety of those agencies that I showed you 2 slides ago. Okay, bilateral agencies, multilateral development banks, and so forth and so on. And they then get disaggregated along different sort of trajectories. Okay, and the ultimate sort of, again, objective being to basically move resources, in this case financial resources, very narrowly defined, to doing what? Avoiding dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. Right? We're going to marshal public dollars and private dollars to get out ahead of the unfolding climate crisis. So what's the dollar figures that are on tap? Well, we get basically sort of two sets of numbers here. The idea is that we need, and some forecasts we need $100 billion. And that's the number that's, I'll call it de rigueur. That's the number that the Green Climate Fund says we need to leverage in terms of helping, particularly both the North and the South, get out ahead of this problem. That number was put out in Copenhagen, and that's been the number that it basically has defined the architectures in the past several slides. It also is defining the architecture of the Green Climate Fund, which is kind of, not quite, but I'll say it's kind of like an air traffic control over all of those different institutions. It's not legally that in the strict sense of the term, but I think we can sort of, we'll take that as a given. What's also interesting, though, is that while the 100 billion is the sort of the generic working number for what those institutions are seeking to raise, some estimate that maybe 2 orders of magnitude more are needed, and possibly more, in order to avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. Right? So there are some arguments over the numbers, but the system is currently designed, those past several slides are designed on this leveraging and putting together and assembling this $100 billion, not the $1 trillion. Okay. So where do we get all that from? Well, it's definitely that number, $100 billion, is a post-Copenhagen number, and it's a number that comes out of the negotiations and the discussion in Copenhagen. But then at Copenhagen, what happens is that tees up that normative sort of timeline that I showed you for moving these policies further. So following on Copenhagen at the Durban talks, we basically get the commitment, essentially reinforce that we will have a negotiations around the second Kyoto Protocol agreement, which hopefully are to conclude in 2015. We get further commitments on the market architecture that I talked about, specifically on continuing to keep the Clean Development Mechanism operational and continuing to encourage the growth of both regional trading schemes as well as maintaining the European emissions trading system. We also get the commitment that basically we see the negotiations in Durban doing launching a process to develop a protocol that hopefully will come and be legally binding, right? And this is why we have this 2015 date, because the process in Durban says, look, we want to come to agree on this by 2015, next year. And this is a sort of key aspect of this, is that what we're going to have coming out of 2015 is a legally binding agreement, essentially a Kyoto Protocol 2 that binds, hopefully, at least the major emitters, but possibly other countries like those emerging economies, China and India in particular. As those negotiations go on, we see that the Doha deal essentially reinforces these key points from both Copenhagen and Durban going forward. Again, making the case that yes, we need to have a second Kyoto protocol, and that process will end in 2020, so that it will turn on in 2015 and in 2020. It simply reiterates the mechanisms that are going to be used, those sort of key sets of solutions I talked about earlier, the Clean Development Mechanism and the trading approach. And it also says that we're going to basically begin to put together a work program to help leverage those dollars that we identified back in Copenhagen. And that work program is embodied in what's now called and known as the Green Climate Fund, which, even though it was christened I guess mandated at Durban and then reiterated in Doha, it really didn't actually begin staffing until early this year. And then again, we see at Doha a new issue here, this issue of focusing on what's called loss and damage provisions. So essentially what's happening in this multilateral climate policy making is governance structures are being created, new institutions are being created, and they're being created in a way that's, I'll say, integrated and intertwined with market approaches and other instruments. So if you were to put together the market approaches with institutional practices, you certainly get that last slide that I talked about, but do you get climate justice? Do you get climate justice? Well, that's what I want to come to in a couple of slides. But what can we take away from that sort of equation, as it were? I think we take away several things. Is that at a sort of a meta level, hegemonic climate governance, climate policy making at the multi-level level really basically premises states and markets over non-state actors. Sort of nothing magical there. Indeed, there is as the number of CSOs, non-state actors have increased in their participation in the multilateral process, there have been efforts actually to completely shut them out and move them out of the process formally, because governments are increasingly not interested in dealing with civil society organizations. So on some level, the process itself, if you recall that previous slide, it not only doesn't necessarily produce movements for climate justice. In a way, it accelerates the role of and the sort of the creation and formation of neoliberal climate policy, and it also, and I will look at this in a few slides, it de-emphasizes or de-accelerates the role of non-state actors, civil society organizations, non-governmental organizations, as well as the various alternatives and proposals that they put out. And I think as well, the whole idea of climate justice, which I want to talk about after this. One of the other things that we can maybe have a conversation on is the way in which the markets have been working. And there's a lot here in the literature that talks about the way in which markets essentially drive a system of accumulation through dispossession. And there's an argument to be made, and I didn't spend much time talking about it, but the way in which right now, if you recall the slide of the dwindling and collapsing price of a ton of carbon in the EU ETS. Right now, the European Union is in a process of trying to bail out those participants in the marketplace, because the price of carbon has not quite gone to zero, but it's been hovering around a euro or so, or above and below euro for quite some time. So many of the participants in that marketplace have been looking for a way out. And so the government has been trying to come up with a process of essentially using taxpayer money in quite the way in which the bailout was approached in this country, to bail that marketplace out, and essentially to shift resources from those that are ostensibly harmed by the unfolding crisis to those that have been profiting in that process. And this whole approach, I think, is embodied, if you have a chance to look at that paper, the Out Antipope, is embodied by a turn and a reliance to finance, right? Lots of things in there, more detailed to talk about, but essentially a priority is placed on using financial instruments and financial approaches to solving the problem, independent of whether or not they work, independent of whether or not they drive policies and practices that address those on the margins that we know that we know from the data are going to be harmed and are being harmed first in those. But again, a heavy reliance is placed on that. And some like to think of that whole process, this idea of accumulation through dispossession, the complete turn to finance, is one of basically shifting, stalling, and stealing, which is a kind of a bon mot of Patrick Vaughan and some other geographers like Dave Harvey, which really is essentially the combination of hegemonic governance practices or climate policy making with the turn to finance and with market approaches is a way of shifting and stalling and stealing resources and moving them into the financial sphere, moving them underneath the state and away from those on the margins, away from citizens, away from social movements. So what then about climate justice? What about that? And how does that enter into this conversation of essentially a particular approach of climate policy making? I think what we can do is we can look at, and colleagues and I have been looking at climate governance across scales, but we can also look at the responses, the counter-hegemonic climate policy making across scales. We can look at it from local to global scales. I said I was a fellow at the Joint Center when I was at Dartmouth. We did a research paper together looking at the way in which African Americans in the U.S. Are interested in the environment in general and climate policy in particular. And it may be surprising to some, certainly not surprising to those of us who follow literature. This really builds on the work of colleague Paul Mohai in Michigan, who's been surveying African Americans and, well, surveying actually all people in the country, but really asking people of color about their interest in the environment. And you not only, Mohai has not only found that there is a tremendous amount of interest, but it's arguably on par or slightly more in terms of dollars they'd like to spend more than their white counterparts in the U.S. But when you ask African Americans in a few cities, Atlanta, Philadelphia, Cleveland, about what they think about global warming, it really mirrors what you see elsewhere in the country. You've got essentially 2/3 of people recognizing that it's a serious problem, and a very, very small sort of group saying, well, no, this is not a serious problem, and about 1/3 sort of recognizing, well, this is something that we think about in the future. The point here is that you have a basis of understanding about environmental problems amongst those that are being harmed more and first and most than you would maybe perhaps otherwise assume. And that kind of understanding, I think, is really the basis not only for the domestic climate justice social movement in the United States, but it's, I think, largely the basis for a broader movement around environmental justice in this country and so forth and so on. And so what does the kind of social movement response look like at slightly higher scales, at national to even global scales? Well, nationally, we see a universe of organizations that are probably too numerous to name the time that we have, but basically a burgeoning climate justice social movement in this country, led by a variety of social movement actors that colleagues and I have been looking at for some time, and that movement is basically making the case that we have to approach climate policy making nationally with a mind towards the uneven nature of the problem in the first place. And we see here, just a few years ago in 2008, quite local actually, the West, We Act for Environmental Justice, which used to be called West Harlem Environmental Justice, right there in New York, convening a climate justice summit, and not by accident, very tactically convened to coincide with the inauguration of the new president, And the first public speech of former EPA administrator taking place there, Lisa Jackson, sort of offering her views on climate justice. So a social movement in the U.S. that builds on the sort of the I'll call it local knowledge of those in marginalized communities that are experiencing the unfolding climate crisis more severe is sort of institutionally configured, not just sort of instantaneously, but over many, many years. What then at the sort of global multilateral levels? I mentioned this, I gave a sort of a tip off of this slide. I told you that a bit ago, that we've seen through time, here, and time is measured in conference of the party meetings. So essentially about a 20-year arc here. And we've seen an increasing number of non-governmental organizations in blue and international or intergovernmental agencies in sort of the line of green here, blossoming of their participation in the formal negotiations at the global level, the formal negotiation of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. What about at the sort of even higher than the global level, if it were, we could call it the transnational level? We've seen a variety of organizations come together and make the case that we need to approach climate policy making not using the dominant hegemonic approaches of the market and configuring institutions that are overly reliant on the marketplace, but that we need to approach policy making by bringing in citizens, by doing it in a transnational way, and organizing both with, to some extent, markets, states, and social movements. And nothing could better embody that sort of call for a three-way approach of markets, states, and social movements than the Bolivian People's World Conference on Climate Change. And this is important in part because it comes immediately after Copenhagen. It comes immediately after the only country, Bolivia, in the negotiations said, we reject the Copenhagen Accord, and they were punished for that outward rejection. But they, as a country, acting as a state, went forward from that Copenhagen process and committed to bringing a formal process led by states, recognizing markets to a degree and involving social movements. So again, pushing for an alternative process to the formal process that we talked about earlier. And that process that came out immediately following Copenhagen is really one that builds up and is built upon the larger kind of transnational, worldwide climate justice social movement organizing that was born out of the negotiations themselves. Several groups now, slightly more than 1,000, initially a few hundred, began coming together in the negotiations and explicitly sort of doing several things at once, making the case within the negotiations against some of the dominant policies, against the excessive reliance on financing the markets that weren't working and have not worked, making the case that the process of the formal process should be opened further to civil society organizations. And that initiative was put together in what is called Climate Justice Now, this large network, essentially to kind of balance out both some of the social movements that had positions that were arguably supportive of the hegemonic policymaking, but also to make space for groups that weren't concordant with that dominant policymaking. But beyond movements across scales, and we don't really have enough time to get into the videos here. There's a couple of videos behind here. You've got intergenerational efforts to combat and rethink the hegemonic climate policy making embodied by youth movements. You've also got a variety of new ideas that are explicitly rooted in justice, particularly the idea of paying an ecological debt and using an ecological debt approach to solving and getting out ahead of dangers of anthropogenic interference. And on some level, this sort of concept at an ideological or theoretical level is what embodied the, if you remember me mentioning it, the Yasuni ITT effort in Ecuador. Right? That effort recently shut down by the president, and actually, just as soon as it was shut down, citizens began a referendum process, which they are right now, as we speak, contesting in Ecuador. They collected enough signatures to bring a referendum to pressure the government to re-enter and retake its commitment on the Yasuni process, and now the government is fighting not to do that. The gist of the Yasuni ITT initiative was basically a challenge to the global north. The Ecuadorian president Correa said, he stepped out and said, look, if you really want to get out ahead of dangerous and anthropogenic interference with the climate system, if you really want to fight climate change, you should just stop pumping oil. And that's, it may sound like hyperbole, but for an OPEC member, that's serious business, right? That's serious business for an OPEC member to sort of say we need to come up with a regime to stop pumping oil. And so the Yasuni initiative was an initiative to basically pilot that concept. And it came with a variety of strains that we can talk about. The gist of it was the demand of the global north that the value of oil that they would stop pumping, that the global north would pay a portion of that, and that, in this case, Ecuador would put in another portion of that. So essentially here, we've got climate justice taking place across geographic scales, across generations, across ideas and ideological dispositions. And just a couple more minutes, I think. So another kind of explicit response to hegemonic climate policy making, where you have a host of non-governmental organizations, civil society groups, making the case about the ETS, or emissions trading systems in general. This one specifically, this letter that came out in 2012 was referring to the European Union emissions trading scheme, but it really builds on a legacy of social movement or counter-hegemonic idea generation, agitation, policy making that starts and has its roots in the U.S. and elsewhere. The domestic variants in the U.S. are sort of parallel to this, where we see groups, particularly in California, some of those groups, and if you remember that slide, that network analysis slide, some of the groups there making the case that we need an environmental justice approach to climate policy making in California, and then going as far to utilize the court system in air versus CARB. Air, of course, the Association of Irritated Residents versus the California Air Resources Board. Essentially, the air group going to the circuit court to get a delay, a stay, turning on the Senate Bill 32, which turns on the California trading system. I would skip the next slide to just quickly, again, do a couple of theoretical take-homes from this. Essentially, here you have the counter-hegemonic responses being largely led by non-state civil society actors, being responses that drive alternatives rooted in ideas of justice, and happening across a variety of spatial and temporal scales. But by driving ideas of justice, I think those ideas are at least along the traditional lines of justice, procedural, administrative, and normative. And by procedural, making the case that really we need completely different sets of policies at the multilateral level if we're going to be seriously able to get out ahead of dangerous and anthropogenic interference with the climate system. By administrative, that means we want to basically redefine who has access to the policy making at the highest levels and at the lowest levels. And by normative, by coming up with new ideas of what justice would mean and what it would be realized on the ground. So then what does all this mean for those of you in the School of Marine sciences. I think it means opportunities for not just social science research, but policy research that I think is certainly readily fundable by places like National Science Foundation. I think that regionally you have already a whole host of conversations that swirl around issues of, I think, climate justice, particularly in as much as New York in this region is within inside of RGGI. And there is a concern that the RGGI experiment isn't scalable. There is a concern that the RGGI experiment may indeed have some problems that they have in California, that the issues around price and so forth. So there's opportunities and resources from places like NYSERDA and other state agencies in the region to basically begin to look at these problems. And this shouldn't be underestimated, in part because right now, one of the sort of thoughts in the realm of hegemonic climate policy making, as it were, is that one of the ways we can deliver a global climate market is to concatenate all these regions, right? And so the problem there, of course, is will we, basically lock in some of the institutional problems that I talked about. But also, I think opportunities for students to engage in some of these questions. And by that, I'll open it up for questions because there's a lot more to talk about other than a gestalt that I gave you, because a lot of it's in literature being colleagues and others. So, please.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
It seems like an underlying theme in your talk is that the negative effects of climate change disproportionately fall on the poor, who contribute less to the causes of climate change. But you didn't actually characterize what those effects are and how they affect the poor more than anybody else. I mean, the poor always have fewer resources. They're always affected more negatively by all sorts of things, wars and economic policies and what have you. So can you quantify a little bit the effects of climate change on poor versus not so poor, and how climate change is different from any other factor that's emerged in history?
Sure. So you all heard the question. I'll stick to the script tightly because that's the way to best answer the question. We have a larger debate on this, if you like. But and what I mean by that, sticking to the script, I'll offer and I'll say that independent of the effects of unfolding climate change, okay, I'll say that the poor are potentially, this is not just the literature, this is just almost point of fact. And this is where I think we have to put our attention as scholars and researchers. The poor are harmed by the current solution set. Right? And what is that? That is a solution set that says we need to raise the price of energy. Right? That is the dominant solution set. Right? And the poor are explicitly harmed by that. And that, colleagues, is a problem that we haven't quite solved, right? The solution that was buried in wax and market that didn't see the light of day was to come up with a credit scheme that would rebate monies to the poor that would see their energy prices rise. Right? The solution in California is sort of similar, that this Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, that's the only committee that didn't sunset in California, that it would be the sort of keeper of a fund. Oh, but when you have a lot of money, you want to act like New Hampshire and even California. You want to rob the till, right? You don't want to give money from the only place that has money to those that it's designated to. So I think, independent of being flooded, and elderly people suffering in apartments, and drawing on the data of my friend Sabrina McCormick, who's been looking at heat wave prices. Independent of all that, and throughout the research that we're doing in 10 cities with the Joint Center that we haven't finished yet, that got the Kresge funding, we gave us $250,000 to look at these 10 cities. Throughout all that stuff, that's resilience policy, planning, and whatnot. Just on the price, just on the key solution set, that in and of itself harms the poor because it raises the price of energy. And we quite haven't figured out how to deal with that. There's sort of piecemeal ways of dealing with that. And I say that's sticking with the script because for me here, the issue is hegemonic climate policy making, right? One that is blind, perhaps at least it's become blind to justice. One that, I'm going to come to this question in a second, one that's also overly reliant on finance of the state. That's what's playing out. So there are others that we could talk about, but that's my concern for this. And there are a lot of people doing the numbers on, what happens when average mean temperature rises in the city, and the fact that in a typical urban area you have less shade cover, and that already exacerbates particularly asthma. People, that's sort of a key indicator to be looking at. But I don't even want to go there first. I want to look at what does this little Rube Goldberg machine produce as a solution, right? And it's produced a solution that's regressive on the poor. And that in and of itself, I think is sort of where we can begin. Where I'd like to begin the first part of this conversation. So I don't know. That's sort of my way of answering it with the script.
Let's go to Michael.
And we can take a couple.
I had that exact question, and I'm not appreciating your answer, because if your answer is it's cost, but in today's marketplace, at least in the Reggie area where we are, okay, renewables cost more, and that would be an improvement to the climate change problem. So if we're told that wind turbines in this area are only economically viable and feasible with oil at $180 a barrel, then the solution's going to cost more to deal with climate change. So how is the price the driving force of affecting the environmental justice community to drive it?
Well, so, and I guess there's a couple of things to tease out of that, the way you set it up. On the one hand, I think that we know that one of the reasons, at least in this country, why renewables are not necessarily, depending on where you live, competitive. It's not quite the case in California, not west. But a lot of that has, I think a lot of it has to do with the subsidy structuring, that subsidies are going into fossil fuels. And they basically create an environment where, in this case, wind or solar aren't competitive. So the point I was making was that one of the things, and I think the architects of energy recognize this, at least in the discussions I have with them, is that they recognize that the price of a ton of CO2 isn't sufficiently high enough to drive innovation by those that are emitting. And so that you wouldn't necessarily see the structural changes by those large emitters in this region that you need to see to get out of any of this problem. And the idea that they would like is to raise that price much higher. And now it doesn't have to be this way, right? But at least the way they did it in Europe, and it's really important to understand, this is something that I want to look at coming soon. The California system was created in part by injecting ideas from Europe. Roughly about a third of those that testified in California, experts, came from the EU ETS system in some way or another. They were from different institutions there. So one of the problems is, I think, when you turn on a marketplace in a large way, in a national way, you may lock in some of the problems. Like, for example, and I think Waxman Market is the best example because that's sort of the only thing we have where they basically did the architecture of a large system for the whole country. And in there, you had a situation where they didn't turn on the auctioning of the permits. The permits were given away. And we know that in the European scheme, when they did that, giving away of allowances to the emitters, they passed that giveaway on to the consumer. They passed the cost on to the consumer. So it had a negative impact on the consumers. So I don't think that it's by any means a small problem that we can sort of say, well, right now the costs are out of sync vis-a-vis renewables. But I think what we can say is that the architecture is one that's oriented towards having a very, very high price of energy in order to drive the innovation to get major emitters to reduce. And that is a problem that almost by fiat, overnight, creates a problem for those that remember almost, there's literature on this, need basically the energy paid for outright. Right? Some people don't have the resources to pay for energy. Right? Some people in this country, and I'd say growing number of people in this country. And so that I don't think it makes that problem go away at all. I don't know if that may not satisfy me.
Let's go to another question, Charlie.
This is a little bit cold-blooded, but it seems to me that the poor of the world suffer now and will suffer more in the future than the well-off. And so while the method of approaching reducing the climate damage by CO2 emitters may not be fair, it seems to me that the poor will ultimately benefit much more by taking care of the problem as soon as we possibly can, by any means we can.
Well, it may seem that way, and I don't want to run through the slides, but and I don't have my little. I guess if there's any slide that embodies it, it's this one. I won't blow it up, but they did that, and this is the graphic of, well, let's just use whatever system we have, right? And this one here, let's keep running the European Union emissions trading system because we have it, and wait and see. Well, it's a decade old and it doesn't work, and actually it's worse than it doesn't work. And this is part of the earlier talk, right? It's a system that arguably is a kind of almost like a rat, than a system it's not reducing emissions. Right? It's moved a tremendous amount of resources to the polluters. It is indeed ignored the American principle of make the polluter pay. So I think we could lock on to that if the dominant systems were producing results. But they're not, empirically. They're not. So locking on to something that of a decade of empirical failure, that's the nod to what Albert Einstein, when you keep doing the same thing over, it doesn't work. That's sort of textbook definition of being insane. I think that there are a host of alternatives. There's questions about scaling, but I think that one of the reasons why it's, I think, important to not just pay attention, but to target social science research on alternative social movements and their ideas. And I wouldn't say they're all social movements, by the way. The Yasuni example, this is a state-led initiative from Ecuador. And it's actually a curious kind of social movement and state-led. The social movement actors sort of thought up the idea with some economists, brought it to the state, to the government, and then it went back around to the multilateral level. Now it's dead. But I think we have to begin to look across a variety of proposals. One of the things that I really want to look at next, and I was just in a work group on this up at UMass, is I want to know, and this would be, I think, a good thesis, certainly we get picker. How many coal-fired power plants have been turned off through agitation and Sierra Club and Beyond Coal, all these groups have these shut down coal-fired power. And to what extent have emissions, particularly in the regi space, where you have an argument to be made about a quasi-functional regi, even though the price is especially high. Have we seen greater reductions through social movement agitation and politics, or in CO2? Or have we seen greater reductions through this regional marketplace? I don't know the answer for regi. I think it's a profoundly interesting question because the answer speaks to what do we rely more on and how should we configure policies, right? Should we begin to make space for new ideas around procedural, administrative, and normative justice, which is really embodying how they put the kill on coal-fired power in this region? Or should we continue down a regi path and ramp regi up, right? When we know we have this is essentially the global legacy of regi. This is the European Union emissions trading scheme price in free fall since inception. Right? So I don't think that the alternatives are necessarily not delivering. I think, and that's why, and it's not my term, this is the literature. That's why we call it hegemonic climate policy making, right? Its point, the idea of the hegemon is that, it's almost you're the fish in the water. You don't know you're in water. Right? The other ideas are approved. So I think there's a conversation to have, and there's a lot of more research to be done in that regard.
So here is what we're going to do. I'm going to allow one more question, and we'll finish the seminar, but then we'll continue with the normal talk. So we're going to go to Anthony.
Yeah, so kind of related to this, I think, and related to what we were talking about here, I think one of the challenges is, right, the EU ETS, right, is kind of an experiment, and it's an experimental approach to try at something. So I have two separate questions. One is, if that's okay. One is that if you can make the argument that the system might have just been designed poorly, and there were problems with it that you could then learn from in designing the next phase of a system, rather than saying that the market-based approach itself is not appropriate. And part of the reason is I think we know that if you try and, let's say we said no one can produce things through fossil fuels, right? Something extreme, or put regulation across all industries to take an approach that they had to reduce pollution by X, right? We know that that would increase costs more than something like a market, theoretically, more than a market trading system would increase costs. So then those costs are then translated into effect or even more, right? Because the cost is going to go somewhere. And the second part is second thing, which is related more to the governance side of things, is how do you think with the Kyoto trying to charge forward a post-Kyoto thing, second Kyoto trying to charge forward, that works in the context of the U.S. not taking, and other countries having pulled out of Kyoto in the midst of it, not taking a leading role in moving forward? Are we going to move toward a more fragmented kind of system of trying to attack the problem, like an ETS, a regi, California, other countries trying to do this on a regional scale rather than trying to get a global agreement when we can't get all the players to sit down and move forward?
Okay, let me see if I can get them both, because each of them are differentially complicated. And if I miss points, we can have it come back in the form. So in the first question, I kind of sort of answered some of it in the talk, and the comment that I made was, well, there's really no way to disaggregate the market from politics. That's for I think it's for science fiction. There's literature, it's true. So there isn't any, so this idea of, well, markets are bad, that's almost saying, the Easter Bunny is bad, Bugs Bunny is bad. There is really no such thing, right? The system is, forget about the unequal bit. This is the system. That is it. Right? And there can be, I mean, and it is markets plus states creating certain institutions that are oriented towards markets. Right? That is it. Right? And so I think, and it's not even I think, the institutional failures are locked in, right? This is without even, we didn't even, this is a whole nother talk about the certain kinds of institutional failures, whether or not there should be allocation of auction, what percent should it be, whether or not the role of lobbying of those that get the allocation versus participating in the auction, the bureaucratic aspects of that addition. Forget about the equals. Right? And remember, the addition hatched us, this kind of even further complicated system here, where you sort of intertwine the public and private finance and pipe it through institutions that ostensibly, and I didn't talk about this all, this is another paper, that if you can't see it here, but these are the multilateral institutions, the banks and agencies. Well, guess what? The World Bank funds the problem. Many of these organizations fund oil and gas, and with no dialogue at all, right? No idea of a dialogue. So I don't think it's an issue of sort of ad hominem attack, markets are evil. What's problematic is this institutional configuration and its orientation to finance. I think that's one thing. The second part of the empiricals are already there on the U.S. It's not enough. The president wants 70% on 205 by 2020. I think that's his number. By most estimates, he's 50% off course, and by some, he's 150% off course, depending on who you believe. And he will admit, he has admitted, at least Podesta admits, yeah, we're off. But we need to do something. So just that in of itself hints at the lack of ambition, at least domestically. And they recognize it. They're not hiding, actually. They openly, if you cast them, they'll admit. They don't like to say it. I don't necessarily, without a crystal ball, I don't know if I can say the regional approach being formalized. I do think it's already happening by default. And it's happening in sort of surprising ways. I think the finance sector is oddly a surprising way, because many places are now in the finance universe recognizing that, and they're gambling. They're sort of hedging, basically, hedging against the risk of high carbon price. Right? So they're now beginning to look at carbon assets as negative on balance sheets, and not quite penalize firms, but at least track the fact that they're there. But a lot of that, oddly enough, is a derivative of, again, social movement agitation and pressure. Maybe that's the time. So.
Yeah, thank you. We're going to stop there.